first for news and the best live sport. This is BBC 5 Live.
It is 5 Live Breakfast, and we're going to talk about a tax on teachers now. Compensation payouts to teachers have soared in the past 12 months. That's according to figures released by the NASUWT. The teaching union has secured more than £27 million for members who've been attacked by pupils, faced discrimination or been injured in the workplace. Well, Doug Melia goes into schools to train teachers in how to deal with difficult pupils. Morning to you, Doug.
Morning, thanks.
So just lean in a little bit to the microphone there and tell us, what's your background? How did you get into this whole field of work?
I left school as a martial arts teacher, actually. That's how I got into it, working in inner city schools with disaffected children, trying to get them back into education. I sort of jumped from that into the world of security, training doorman and working as an enforcement officer myself. So removing children from protest sites where activists have brought them on site. So in schools and outside of schools, really. And I saw there was a massive grey area where people weren't sure of their rights, what they could or couldn't do.
Right. Is it quite depressing to discover that, you now, someone with all of that combat, understanding and experience, has to take that into schools?
It's actually quite empowering. Yeah, so we speak to people about the legalities as well. It's not just the physical side of things. Talking to people about rights, responsibilities, duty of care, things like that. People find they're empowered after the sessions and after the training, and they know what to do. They've actually had some guidance, really, which from the government there's not that much out there, to be honest. Because
when we're hearing about the number of compensation claims going up, clearly this is an issue. So what kind of things, when you go into school situations, you're giving advice to teachers, what are you telling them?
Powers and duties, that's the first thing we'll talk about. People recognising where their powers stop and their duties begin. So, for example, the power to restrain pupils, break up fights, remove them from classrooms. The duty of care to children is something that would come after that of a teacher. So, for example, first aid. Before you treat a casualty, you check for danger. If it was too dangerous, you then wouldn't carry on with that assessment. So there are some teachers that are expected to be almost superheroes, to run in and break up fights and restrain pupils when really it might not be safe to do so. It might be better to contain rather than restrain, summon help from other members of staff, or in extreme circumstances, then get the police involved.
What's the worst kind of violence you've ever heard teachers tell you about at schools that they've experienced?
I've heard of teachers being bitten, kicked, thrown to the ground, but I think the worst part is the emotional side of things. Somebody who's been physically assaulted might be far less impacted than someone who's just been bullied or harassed or been put in those situations in the first place.
And to go back to what you were talking about, is that the difficulty with teachers? Because it's a pastoral job, isn't it, really? You're there to teach people, you're there to care for them. When they see trouble kicking off, for example, between pupils, it must be very difficult for them to sort of do that mental check and go, hang on, what about my safety? Rather than getting involved and trying to pull the kids apart. Yeah,
it's a dynamic risk assessment at the end of the day for staff to make that split-second decision. The law says that we can do what we honestly and instinctively feel is necessary. So in an emergency, these things happen. Like you say, if a fight breaks out in front of someone, your instinct is to separate the pupils. However, if staff have been taught some kind of a technique and by some kind of a miracle they manage to remember this single person technique and they try it on a child, they might even try it in a fight, for example, on the wrong child. You then got to spend the next parents' evening explaining to mum why you held her son whilst the other child gave them a broken nose. So it's about a dynamic risk assessment, but trying to plan to avoid things rather than remembering difficult techniques and then trying to summon them in the spur of a moment.
It's a bit depressing, though, isn't it, to think we have reached this stage in our school life and that, we are in a kind of compensation culture now where teachers have to not only think about protecting themselves, but think about what they could be implicated in if they do get involved in a situation where somebody else comes off worse.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But in law, we have acts and we have omissions, and you are equally responsible for the consequences of your omissions as you are your acts. So in certain circumstances, somebody may act, they may be accused of something, but if a teacher fails to act, then exactly the same could happen from that. So it is a balancing act, and I think the more clear, concise guidance we can give with training, the easier it will make their jobs.
Because do you think it's something that's putting people off wanting to join the profession? Because it is a real issue.
Absolutely, and from the information we're given this morning, it's encouraging people to leave the profession. And people who've spent a long time getting trained, a lot of time's been invested, a lot of blood, sweat and tears to get into that job that they clearly love, to work with children. They've obviously got into that profession, and they're now forced to leave because perhaps they've been given inappropriate advice.
Yeah, well, listen, it's been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in. Doug Melia there goes into schools, trains teachers on how to deal with difficult pupils. If you are one of those teachers on Easter holiday right now and you've been in one of those sticky situations, we would love to hear from you. 85058 or at BBC 5 Live.
This is BBC 5 Live.